Hey, good morning. It's 11 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jana, and I'm going to talk about Asian languages. So the reason I decided to talk about this is because I've been to several of these events now. This is actually my fourth time at the Polyglot gathering, so I've met a lot of people who've learned a lot of languages, but a lot of them have said to me, I'd really like to learn Chinese or I'd like to learn Japanese, but I'm really scared, because of the characters or because of the tones or whatever. And I think it's really a shame if people are intimidated out of learning these languages, because these are really fascinating languages, and I don't think they're as monumentally difficult as they're often made out to be. So I just like to encourage more people to learn these languages. So a little bit about my background. My specialty is Japanese. Japanese was the first language I started to learn on my own when I was about 13. Then later I spent about 5 to 6 years living in Japan. I don't know exactly because it wasn't a continuous period. And I'm now working as a Japanese English translator and occasional interpreter. So the picture is of me on an interpreting job in Japan. And I've also studied Mandarin Chinese and Korean. I used to speak them both better than I do now. They've gotten a little bit rusty from lack of use, but I speak those languages maybe around a B1 level, so not amazing, but okay. I've also studied Thai. At one point I was actually able to have a conversation in Thai, but unfortunately never used the language, so pretty much forgot it. So if you speak to me in Thai, I might understand, but won't be able to answer you. But I'm actually not going to address Thai in this presentation. I'm going to be focusing on the East Asian languages, specifically Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. And when I say Chinese in this presentation, I'm talking about Mandarin Chinese. As you may know, there are actually many Chinese languages. Mandarin Chinese is the most common one, the one people usually learn. It's also the easiest to learn. And I'm focusing on these languages because they're the ones I know, first of all. I also think these are the ones people are generally most interested in learning, and also the ones people seem to be the most intimidated by. So I figured they'd be good ones to focus on. How I'm going to approach this, I'm not going to stand here and tell you these languages are easy. Personally, I don't think that's really helpful. Is this not really true? You guys are all smart people. You've probably all learned some languages before. So you know that no language is really easy to learn, right? They all take time and effort to learn, but it's also not as ridiculously difficult as people often like to make it out to be. You put in the time and the effort, you can learn it. And Asian languages are no different. There are actually some aspects of Asian languages that are pretty easy as far as languages go. So I'm going to show you what those are. Then I'm going to break down the parts that are a little less easy. So they'll hopefully seem a little less intimidating. I think a lot of the reason people find things scary is just because they're unfamiliar. So when you know a little bit more about how something works and what it actually is, it's a little less scary. And I'm going to assume that you've never studied any of these languages and you know nothing about them. You've maybe just heard a few scary stories. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about pronunciation and tones. And I'd like to start out by mentioning that actually not all Asian languages have tones or difficult pronunciation. As a matter of fact, Japanese pronunciation is very easy. I would say as far as pronunciation goes, Japanese is one of the easiest languages on the same level as maybe Italian or Spanish. There are only 5 vowels, a, u, e, o, very simple. The consonants are mostly familiar consonants that already exist in languages you probably speak already. The trickiest ones are not really even that tricky. There's a flipped R sound, like da-di-du-de-do, and there's a he sound. But if you speak German, you can probably already make that sound. It's kind of a harsh, those would be like the CHI sound in German. Let's see, there is a distinction between single and double letters. So for example, mo is a different word than mo, and moto is a different word than motto. It's kind of like, Italian with the double consonants. It's also not too bad. And there are no tones. There is something called pitch accent, as you may have heard, but this actually varies among native speakers. It's different depending on what region of Japan they come from. And it's actually not very important for being understood, so about 99% of the time you can get this wrong, everybody will still understand you. So if you want to learn an Asian language that's easy to pronounce, maybe try Japanese. Second easiest one in terms of pronunciation, I would say, is Korean. It also has no tones, but it does have some trickier sounds, definitely more complex sound system than Japanese. Probably the thing people tend to find the most difficult is there is a distinction between plain, tense, and aspirated consonants. So for example, you can see these three K sounds here. So in Korean, ka, ga, and ka are three different sounds. So there are several like sets of consonants like this. For example, there's also ta, da, ta, and so on. So that can be, it might take some time to sort of train yourself to pronounce those if you've never encountered this before. There are also more vowels than in Japanese, but I don't think they're too hard. There are 8 basic vowels: a, o, u, I, and e. And there are also diphthongs made of combinations of those vowels. Japanese actually has no diphthongs. Every vowel is pronounced separately in Japanese. But there are also no tones. So if you just don't want to deal with tones, maybe try Japanese or Korean. But if you want to learn Chinese, of course, you have to learn tones. So now let's talk about tones. So who has seen this before? So this is an actual Chinese sentence, "Mama, ma, mama," which means, does mother scold the horse? Very useful. You never know when you might need that. Obviously, this is, a bit of a ridiculous sentence that's kind of been made up to be silly and to scare people out of learning Chinese. But actually, tones aren't really that scary if you realize that, as a matter of fact, tones also exist in English. For example, hello, hello, hello. Right, so I just said the exact same word 3 times. All I did was change the tone. And if you speak English well, which I think all of you do, you probably interpreted those 3 hellos in different ways. So in English, we use tones to create different nuances in meaning. The only difference in a tonal language is that instead of indicating difference in nuance, they use tones for differences in fundamental meanings. So for example, Beijing is the capital of China, and Beijing is a completely different word that means background, like the background of a picture. So you just need to learn to say each word with the same tones every time. So every language has tones, really. In tonal language, they're just used in a more specific and a different way. And just a side note, it helps if you have musical training. So if you've ever studied music, if you've taken singing lessons or piano lessons or anything like that, you might not find tones very difficult. I suspect this is the reason tones were not very difficult for me. I actually never struggled with them, and I think it's because I had a lot of musical training, so I was able to just pick them up right away. But if you don't have musical training, or you just feel like you don't have the natural ability to learn tones, here are some ideas for some techniques you could use. First one, pretty obvious. Listen carefully to natives, of course. Just spend a lot of time listening. Try to mimic the tones. Try to learn to recognize them. Another technique I like to use actually with any language, not just a tonal language, is try listening to one phrase on repeat. So just get a recording for example of like travel phrases or something like from a phrase book or something. Play one phrase. As soon as it finishes playing, you just click the play button again. You play it over and over and over, maybe 10, 20, like 50 times in a row. And weird things happens when you do this. It kind of starts to sound like music in your head. And you start to hear more like the melody of the phrase rather than, the individual words. And so I find this is a good technique for learning to have like proper intonation in a language. So if you're struggling with tones, maybe try that out. Another thing you can do is when you try to actually pronounce the tones is really exaggerate them. I've seen some learners of Chinese do this. They'll say like, 很高兴认识你, very exaggerated way. Whereas like a native speaker would be more like 很高兴认识你, a little more natural. So you might sound a little silly, but this can help in the beginning to sort of cement the tones in your mind. It just be really exaggerated. Some people like to draw the tone marks in the air. They'll like be doing this with their finger while they're speaking. 很高兴认识你. Also looks a little silly, but you can do it like in the privacy of your room when you're studying, whatever. And maybe some other people here have some other ideas for learning tones, so if you'd like to share, please do so later. We'd all be interested to hear. First, so now I'm going to move on to the complex writing systems. I think this may be the thing that people are most scared of, especially with Chinese and Japanese. But before I get to the complex ones, I want to mention, actually, not all Asian writing systems are complex. As a matter of fact, Korean Hangul has been called the most logical alphabet ever created. So these letters might look complicated, but let's see how to use this pointer thing. Here. So these individual boxes, like this one here and this one here, these are actually letters stacked together to form syllables. So this thing right here is not one letter. This is actually 1, 2, 3, 4 letters that form one syllable. So the letters are just grouped together by syllables. This is 2 letters, 1, 2, and this is also 2 letters. And these letters are actually made to show the shape of your mouth when you pronounce them. So that's pretty cool. And you can probably learn to read it in a few days. It might take you a little longer to actually learn to pronounce the sounds correctly, but in terms of learning to read, it's fairly easy as far as alphabets go, and it's quite logical. So if you don't want to deal with the characters, maybe try Korean. But of course, you know, if you want to learn Chinese or Japanese, you have to learn Chinese characters. So they are called Chinese characters because they originally come from Chinese, but they are also used in Japanese. They used to be used in Korean. They're not used anymore in modern day Korean, but the origins of many Korean words still do come from Chinese characters. So they're actually connected to all of these languages. So when you think of Chinese characters, maybe you think of something like this. This is the character for depression. Probably because depressed is the way you feel after writing this 50 times in a row. But this is actually a pretty exceptional example of a rather complex character. Not all of them look this crazy. Many of them are much simpler, like this one. This means person. So this is actually supposed to look sort of like a stick drawing of a person. At some point along the way, this poor person lost their arms and their head, but you can sort of imagine, you know, that, okay, this is maybe supposed to look like a drawing of a person. And there are lots more characters like this that are just simple drawings meant to represent something. So, for example, this is tree, river, fire, car. This is maybe a little harder to see, but if you just sort of imagine flipping this on its side, you can see how it kind of looks like a 5-year-old stick drawing of a car. That's all these are, 5-year-old stick drawings. This one means power. That's a little harder to imagine. It's kind of abstract, but it actually evolves from this thing on the top, which is supposed to look like an arm sticking out from the body to represent power. So this means power. Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting. So if you take the character for car and you add it to the character for power, you get this character, which means movement. So a car with power moves. It makes sense, right? And then if you take the character for person and add it to the character for movement, the character for person gets kind of squished together. It looks a little different, but it's still person. So person moving, this means work. So a person moving is working. It's logical, right? So these are not just random collections of lines and squiggles. They actually make sense. They have parts that are put together in a logical way. Now let's go back to this. This is actually really interesting if you look at how it's written in Chinese characters. This is what it looks like. Now, do you notice anything about these characters? You notice they all have the same part in them? Okay, they all have this part here, right? So this character right here means horse. This is another one of those simple ones that at some point in time was supposed to look like a drawing of a horse. Obviously, it's morphed over the years and now is something more abstract. But anyway, this means horse and is pronounced ma, okay? And this first character is the character for mother, okay? So here we have the part that means horse, and we have this part which means woman. Okay, now you're thinking, horse, woman means mother? That doesn't make sense. Actually, it does make sense. If you remember, the character for horse is pronounced ma, and the word mother in Chinese is ma. Okay, so you're meant to look at this and go, okay, this has something to do with a woman and it's pronounced something like ma. Oh, it must be ma, mother. Okay, so this is perhaps the most common way to build a character in Chinese is you have one component that represents the meaning and you have another component that represents the pronunciation. Okay, so there are many, many, many characters that are built like this and they're actually very logical. And these characters can actually help you to learn unfamiliar vocabulary. This is another thing people may find intimidating, so I'm going to talk about this next. But before I go into the part to do with the characters, I'd like to mention, actually, not all Asian vocabulary is unfamiliar. So if you want to learn Japanese or Korean, there are actually lots and lots of loanwords from English and other European languages. So here, on this first bullet point, I have some Japanese words that come from English. Teburu. Can you guess what this means? Table. Okay. Second one, door. What do you think that is? Door. Okay. Pen. Pretty obvious. It's a pen. Pan. How about pan? What is that? It means bread. It comes from Portuguese, and it means bread. There are several words from Portuguese and Japanese because the Portuguese were the first foreigners in Japan. This last one, this is interesting. Arubaito. What do you think this is? Yeah, it comes from German Arbeit, but for some reason in Japanese it actually means part-time job. So, slightly different meaning, but it's a familiar word, right? And here we have some words in Korean. This one's pretty easy. Ice-cream. Ice-cream means ice cream. Game, what do you think that is? Game, okay. News. News. This one's a little tricky. Aparte. This means apartment, so it's abbreviated. But yeah, and as a matter of fact, all of these Korean words are actually used in Japanese as well. Ice-cream, game, news, apato. So there are many, many, many words like this. It may take some time at first to get used to the way they're converted into the Japanese pronunciation. But once you get used to it, you'll actually find you have a ton of words from English or other languages that you know that you can get started with in these languages. So they're actually not so unfamiliar. Now, if you're learning Chinese, there are very few English loan words in Chinese, so the vocabulary is more foreign, but it's actually very logical. So now we're going back to the characters again. So this is the Chinese word for computer, 电脑. This literally means electric brain, right? 电话, telephone, literally means electric speech. 电视, electric vision, means television. 电车, electric car, means train. It makes sense. Also, Chinese words for animals are kind of fun. This is 斑马, striped horse, means zebra. Okay. 长颈鹿, long-necked deer, is a giraffe. 河马, river horse, hippopotamus. Not sure why it's a horse, but this is kind of funny. 海豚, ocean pig, for some reason, is a dolphin. Oh, okay. I don't speak Greek, so I didn't know that. That's very interesting. Okay. 熊猫, bear, cat, is a panda. This is one of my favorites. 猫头鹰, cat head eagle, is an owl. So they make sense, and they're actually really fun, like if you learn what the origins of these words are. And another, this actually means that a lot of advanced vocabulary is in fact easier than in European languages. So for example, here's an English word. Now, if you speak Greek, you might know what the origins of this word are, but most native English speakers don't speak Greek, so they might be like vaguely familiar with this word. They probably know it has to do with some sort of medical condition, but they probably don't know like exactly what encephalitis is. However, the Japanese word for encephalitis, I assume the Chinese as well, literally means brain inflammation. So you look at these characters and you know exactly what it means. And by the way, you might notice this character for inflammation, which also means flames, is just two characters for fire stacked on top of each other. So there's another logical Chinese character. So I actually find that things like medical terms are often easier to understand in Japanese than in English, and English is my native language. Like that's how logical it is, because you just see the characters and they immediately make sense. Even if you've never seen the word before, you know what it means. Another bonus, if you're one of those ambitious polyglots and you'd like to learn all of these languages, Chinese, Japanese, and Korean actually have many cognates between them. By the way, I think this goes for Vietnamese as well. Vietnamese also has a lot of Chinese origin words, but I don't speak Vietnamese, so I'm just talking about Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. So here's an example. This is the word for telephone again, electric speech. So the Mandarin is 电话, Japanese 電話, and Korean 通話. So they're very similar. Here's another one. This is the word for time. Characters are not so interesting. This is just time, period. But anyway, the Mandarin is 时间, Japanese 時間, and Korean 時間. So they're very similar. And these are just a couple examples, but there are many, many, many words like this. So you can quickly learn a lot of vocabulary. So personally, I speak Japanese much better than Chinese or Korean. So sometimes when I'm speaking Chinese and Korean, and I don't know a word, I'll try to guess the word based on Japanese, and about half the time it seems to work. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about is grammar, abstract grammatical concepts. So just some notes about grammar. If we want to compare the grammar of these three languages, I would say by far, Chinese grammar is the easiest. And Korean grammar is the most difficult. Japanese is somewhere in the middle. Japanese and Korean grammar are actually extremely similar. Korean is just like a more complex version of Japanese. So first, let's talk about Chinese. If you're intimidated by grammar, you might want to try Chinese. It is a misconception to say that Chinese has no grammar. You will sometimes hear people say this. Of course, Chinese has grammar. All languages have grammar, or they couldn't function as languages. But especially at the beginning, when you first start learning, Chinese grammar is going to feel very easy because, first of all, it has 0 verb conjugations. Words do not inflect at all. And you can basically talk like a caveman. Me go store buy milk is a perfectly correct Chinese sentence. So yeah, I can literally translate, I can literally translate this into Chinese. 我去商店买牛奶. That's perfectly correct. So yeah, as you go on and as you get more advanced in Chinese, especially, you'll have to, learn some grammar. But at least in my experience, it never felt as difficult as learning a European language. So, like, if you can learn like Russian or German, like Chinese is going to be really easy in terms of grammar. Now, about Japanese and Korean grammar, these are more complex. Definitely. If you want to learn both, I would recommend you start with Japanese. Basically, everything in Japanese is easier except for the characters. But by learning the characters through Japanese, that's going to help you better understand the origins of the words in Korean, because a lot of them also come from Japanese characters. So ultimately, it's going to make it a lot easier to learn Korean. In Japanese, the conjugations are actually very regular. There are almost no irregular verbs. There's a very small number of them. Korean has many more irregular verbs and many more forms, so it's just more complex. But the basic grammatical structure of these languages is almost identical. So most of the time you can take a Japanese sentence, translate it literally word to word in Korean, and you'll get a correct Korean sentence. The difficulty with these languages, I think, is not so much the complexity of the grammar, especially with Japanese, as that the concepts are just very foreign because they have some grammatical concepts that simply do not exist in European languages. For example, we have multiple politeness levels. So you have to use a different verb form depending on if you're talking to a friend versus a coworker versus your boss, or versus, if you're someone in a business addressing a customer, then you have to use a different form. So, it takes some time to learn these forms and the situations in which you have to use them. Also, there's a distinction in these languages between subject versus topic. I'm not going to try to explain what that is, but it's similar to trying to understand the difference between definite and indefinite articles if you don't have those in your native language. It's just a different concept. However, these grammatical features are fascinating reflections of their respective cultures. They say that language and culture are connected. I think you can really see this very clearly in these languages, and it's really interesting. And also, there are amazing resources available for these languages. So I always find when learning a language that one of the biggest factors on how easy or difficult it is what resources I have available to me. So these languages are pretty popular to learn, so fortunately there are some great resources. Some I would recommend for Japanese, Take Him's Guide to Japanese Grammar, and for Korean, Talk to Me in Korean. These resources are both available online and they're completely free. So those are great. Actually, one of the main reasons I started learning Korean was just because Talk to Me in Korean exists and I wanted to use it. It's that good of a resource. So yeah, that's all I had to say for now. I wanted to leave some time for questions. So yeah, I know it was a very sweeping overview, but feel free to ask me about anything you'd like to know more about. Thank you.
Hello. Okay. So the most popular question was, what about music in Chinese? Do the tones get preserved when the intonation has to respect the melody rather than the tones?
No. No, Chinese music does not preserve the tones. So yeah, when you first start learning Chinese, I don't know, maybe you should actually even avoid listening to music if you think that would confuse you, because, obviously in music they have to follow the melody. So no, tones do not get preserved in music. You can. You can. It's...
I've heard that there are relative tones according to the melody, but I've never studied the subject.
Yeah, well, if you're watching a music video or something, of course they always have the Chinese subtitles, so you can read the characters. But yeah, somehow you can understand. I guess if you're a native speaker of Chinese, you can still understand, based on the context or whatever. But yeah, the tones are definitely not preserved exactly. Sometimes they might try to approximate them, but yeah, it's definitely not the same as the tones when the language is spoken.
If electric car means train, how to describe electric cars such as Tesla?
Does somebody know how to say electric car in Mandarin? I guess it would be electric automobile or something. Right. So I'm guessing it's the same in Mandarin, just more literally electronic automobile. Yeah. Yeah, so that's a different kind of train. That's the more mechanical kind of train. And the electric train is the one that's electric. Yeah. Yeah.
How about Chinese pinyin? I heard it's good to try to avoid it unless necessary and try to associate the sound directly with the character. What's your strategy?
Okay, so for those of you who don't know, pinyin is the system used in mainland China to write Chinese in the English alphabet or in Roman alphabet. Yeah, I guess that's an individual thing. I guess if you feel like seeing Chinese written in the Roman alphabet would confuse you and make it harder for you to hear the correct sounds, maybe you want to avoid it. If you really don't want to learn pinyin and you want a different system for learning to read Chinese phonetically, you could try the Taiwanese system, which is called BOPOMO, just BOPOMO. And that's an alphabet, basically, that was created in Taiwan to teach children to read Chinese. So you could try that if you really don't want to use pinyin. I personally don't have a problem with pinyin. I learned to read Chinese through pinyin. It wasn't an issue for me, but I think it would just be an individual preference.
Sorry to interrupt again, but if you are interested in this question, I will give a podcast next about this new system.
Thank you. Yeah, so check that out also.
What method do you recommend for learning Chinese characters? Or if you're familiar with this one, high six method?
Yeah, there was actually a really good talk just before me this morning about this. Pablo gave a talk about how he learned the 2,000 Japanese characters in a couple months with this mnemonic method called the high sig method. Yeah, I think that's a really good method. It's the best method that I've heard of for learning the characters. I personally actually learned them the more traditional way, just by writing them over and over. But yeah, that was a long time ago. This was before I knew, anything about how to learn languages, or before I'd heard of these other methods. But I think the mnemonic method is probably the best method there is. So if you don't know, look up the Heisig method, Heisig, James Heisig. He has a good mnemonic method through learning characters.
How can I learn reading Chinese word if I don't know the meaning of this word and I meet it for the first time?
So how can you read a Chinese word if you don't know what it means and you're seeing it?
How can I learn reading Chinese word if I haven't heard it yet, I guess?
Okay, so how do you pronounce the character if you're seeing it for the first time and you don't know how it's pronounced? Well, obviously you don't know. You have to look it up somehow. So I would recommend with Chinese and Japanese, when you're first learning to read, that you use some sort of app or some sort of like digital tool for learning to read, because if you're reading characters on paper, there is a way to look them up. You can look them up in a dictionary, but it's rather time-consuming because you have to like look up the stroke order, look up like the components of the characters, and it's rather cumbersome. So it's much easier if you're on some sort of digital device and you can use like a pop-up dictionary or something. You just hover the mouse over the word and the reading and the meaning just pops up for you. I definitely recommend take advantage of technology. Also, nowadays there are apps, where you can, write a character by hand in the app with your finger, and it will, come up with the definition and the pronunciation. So, use technology. That's my advice.
Then some people were interested in seeing again the depression glyph.
The what?
The depression.
Okay. That's somewhere here. There.
Here
you feel depressed yet?
Is it possible to learn Chinese or Japanese without learning about the alphabets?
Yes. Yes, if you are not interested in learning to read and write and you only want to speak and listen, then sure. There's nothing wrong with that. It just depends on your goals. But learning to read the characters will help you understand the language much better, understand how it works. So ultimately, I think it's helpful to learn the characters, because as you get more advanced, it becomes easier to learn new words. Yeah, it's possible, definitely, especially, if you are not interested in becoming super advanced, you don't necessarily want to be super fluent in a language, you just want to know some basics to travel in Japan or China or whatever, then sure, you could just learn it phonetically, and that's fine. You just wouldn't be able to read.
Then here's a question about if you have any advice for searching for a word in a physical dictionary.
Searching for a word in
Chinese.
Okay, so searching for a word in a physical dictionary, there are a few different methods you can use. For most of them, you kind of have to know something about how to write the characters, because usually they involve the stroke order, or the number of strokes. And if you don't know anything about how to write the characters, you're not going to be able to look at it and know the stroke order or the number of strokes. So yeah, that's why I would really recommend just sticking with the digital methods. But yeah, if you want to look it up in a physical dictionary, you have to use the stroke order, or you have to, you can also look it up by radical, which is like one component of the character. For example, this character here, it has a tree in it. This is tree. So, you could look up all the characters that have tree in them, and then you go by the number of strokes. It's really very cumbersome. So yeah, if possible, I would recommend going with the digital method.
Then some people are interested if you could describe this character more in detail.
Okay, people are really interested in this character. Okay. Do you just want to know what all the parts of it are?
Yes, all the components.
All the parts of it are. Okay, I can try. Well, this is a tree, right? And this is a tree. And this actually means like a can, like a tin can. I don't know. This character, it honestly doesn't make much sense. I don't really remember. It's been so long since I learned to read and write the characters. I don't really remember like what the logic is to it anymore. Yeah, this is like a I don't know, it's like a crown or a hat. This looks like a tooth, kind of. It's like, this is rice in the middle. This is, I'm not sure what this means. This is a part that you see in a lot of characters. I'm not sure what that means. Yeah, I don't really know. Maybe somebody here can explain it better. Can anybody explain it? Oh. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, you can look it up. Look up, if you really want to know, Google, Chinese character depression etymology or something. You can find it. But after a while, like I've been, reading Japanese for so long that I don't really remember anymore, like what the components are. It just becomes automatic after a while, So, like I just look at this character and it means depression. I don't really think about it. So, yeah.
Can you read the Japanese texts or books? If yes, how long does it take you to learn this?
Can I personally read Japanese texts? Yes, I can. How long does it take you? I don't know. I can't say how long it would take you. Like I said, Japanese was actually the first foreign language I ever started to learn. I was 13 years old, so I didn't know anything about learning languages. I just started learning it, out of interest. Like I thought it sounded cool. And so I just kind of tried out a bunch of different things. I didn't really know what I was doing. I probably didn't, do it in the best way, and I wasn't really concerned about time. I was just kind of enjoying myself. So, it took me like several years probably. But, I certainly don't think that it would necessarily take you several years. Like the presentation earlier this morning, Pablo said he learned 2,000 Chinese characters in 50 days. I think that's, so yeah, it just depends on what methods you use, like how much time you have. It's kind of hard to give you a number, like it's going to take you this long. It really depends.
How long did it took you?
I honestly am not sure. Like I said, it was a really long time ago that I started to learn. So a few years maybe. I don't know.
And
oh, Dian Pingche is electric car. Okay, thank you. I didn't know that.
How can you look up a character in a dictionary? Are they sorted in any way?
Okay, this is like the same question again. Yeah, like I said, it's usually by stroke order.
Stroke order, okay. How important is to learn the Chinese characters behind Korean words? I guess they mean.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, it's not super important. So most Korean people cannot write Chinese characters. They don't know that many Chinese characters. They do learn them in school, but it's just Chinese characters are not used in the modern day language. So it's not super important. You can learn Korean without ever studying characters. However, I think if you do learn them, it will help you to understand the language much better and ultimately make it much easier for you to learn new vocabulary. If you even learn just a few basic characters, you don't even need to learn that many. Even learning just a few will help you acquire a lot more vocabulary. For example, if you have, one character for person, for instance, you can build a bunch of words that contain the character for person, and that all have the same pronunciation in Korean. So it just helps you to understand the words better. But, if that's not important to you, you don't have to. So it's up to you.
Okay, I believe there was... Oh, no, one more question, okay. In which of the three languages do you feel the most psychological or cultural difference, and how did it affect your learning experience? How did you overcome it?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. So, like for me personally, I grew up in the U.S., but I actually never really felt like very American. Like I never had a very strong like American identity. I always kind of felt actually out of place in my native country. And in many ways, I felt like I belonged more in Japanese culture. Like the first time I went to Japan, I was like, oh wow, this is like my home. Like these people are like me, they think like me. Because I'm kind of like a more introverted person. And the culture in the US is very extroverted, so that always kind of made me feel a little out of place. And Japan just kind of felt more like me. So I actually didn't feel so much of the cultural dissonance, at least at first. After living in Japan for a few years, I did start to feel, some of the other aspects of the culture that were more negative for me. For example, the work culture is very difficult in Japan. There's a lot of pressure, to work very hard and put your work above everything else. And so, it eventually became difficult for me to stay there for that reason. But, by that time I already spoke the language. So, yeah, I don't know. I didn't really have that much of a experience with a different culture being an obstacle to learning the language. That's just me. I don't know. Maybe somebody else has a different experience they'd like to share. But yeah, for me, it wasn't really an issue.
Okay, I believe this is the last question on Slido, so we can take some more questions from the audience. We have 5 minutes. Just please, please make your questions brief and to the point. Thank you.
How to create nuance in a tonal language. Okay, that's a good question. So in Chinese, obviously you cannot use tones to create nuance because the tones are established for the meaning of the words. So they have things like little words that you can add to the end of the sentence to create a different nuance. They have these things called particles. So for example, there's a word ah. Ah is just a word you add to the end of a sentence, and it's just kind of like saying, oh, you're telling somebody a piece of new information. Oh, it's this, blah, blah, blah. So there are a lot of little words like that. Basically, they do it through the sentence structure, through the grammar, and through just adding little words to the sentence. Does that make sense? How about irony? Actually, irony is a very Western thing. Irony actually, at least in Japan, irony doesn't really work. Japanese people don't really understand irony. It's just not part of their culture. So yeah, if you try to make a sarcastic joke in Japanese, it won't work. Nobody will get it. They have a different kind of humor. So I think that's actually a cultural thing more than a linguistic thing. It's a very Western kind of concept. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. More often or less often than Japanese. Well, yeah, my Korean is not that great, but I think your question is if somebody says a word I don't know in Korean, can I guess what it means based on what I think the characters are? Yes, yes, because a lot of times it will sound like the Japanese word or it will sound like the Chinese word too. And so then I can guess what the characters are. So yeah, that does happen. Any other questions? Yeah. Okay, there are some instances where tones can change. There are rules for that. I can't really get into an explanation, but yeah, for example, if these certain two tones go together, this tone will change in this way. There are rules to it. It's not random, and it's not really a whole sentence will change. It's certain tones will change in certain instances. Yes. Yes, yes. I don't speak any other Chinese languages, but in Mandarin, the tones are quite simple. It's probably the simplest of the tonal languages. Mandarin has only 4 tones. You could say 5, depending on if you count the tone that's a non-tone. But yeah, other tonal languages, for example, Thai has 5 tones. Vietnamese has, I think, up to 6, depending on which dialect of Vietnamese. Cantonese has 9. So. Mandarin is actually the simplest tonal language if you want to get started with tonal languages. Any other questions? Okay. Yes? Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, I think it's a lot of people think that if you like get the tones even a little bit wrong, like nobody will understand a word you're saying. That's actually not quite true. I mean, just like we in English, we can understand people with an accent. Chinese people can understand you if you make a little mistake. Usually, it's okay. You'll still be understood. There are some instances where there are two different words that are differentiated by the tones. You say the word with the wrong tone, it comes out as the other word. You might create a misunderstanding. But you don't have to get it like 100% perfect all the time to be understood. So. Yeah, that's a good point also. Yes. So I can't quite hear you. Are you asking if Japanese has an alphabet? What Latin alphabet? Oh, yeah, so there.
Okay. Yeah, so my question was because you talked about Korean writing and Chinese writing, and Japanese writing you said there are 200 characters, and so I wasn't sure if these 200 characters you have.
I didn't say 200 characters. I'm not sure where you.
Okay.
I'm not sure where you got that from. But in Japanese, they use the Chinese characters, the same in Chinese. They also have two phonetic writing systems they use. They're called hiragana and katakana. So the katakana and the hiragana, they're exactly the same sounds, but the katakana are used to write foreign words, and sometimes they're used for emphasis, sort of like writing something in all caps in English. And they are phonetic. They're technically not alphabets, they're technically syllabries because each letter represents one syllable. But yeah, they're as easy to learn as any other script that's an alphabet. But those are used in addition to the Chinese characters. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. I think we're out of time, but thank you so much for coming.